What is the story behind this photo here?
Well, it was one of our Oh-6s that got shot down. Fortunately, nobody actually got hurt. I would think, the real message is, bullets are going through these armor-plated boxes like they're wet cardboard. And we had armor-plated seats, and we wore an armor vest, but the seats were literally worthless. I mean, I often wonder why we just didn't pull them out and just save the weight, because they were designed to stop like a 30 caliber round at 100 or 200 yards. When we were being shot at, it was always within 50 yards. So yeah,
That's because you flew so close to the ground.
right, and so slow. So an AK-47 round would just zip, right through the thing. And in fact, one of my good friends, while hovering over a VC foxhole, he leaned way out of the seat and out of the ship, and a VC behind him in another foxhole opened up with his AK-47 and just riddled his seat. Fortunately, he missed him because he was only about 20 feet away. He must have got excited. And, when he got back, the seat was full of bullet holes. The glass was blown out in the front. Had he been in the seat, he would have been killed.
Low observation helicopter.
Right.
What was well, first of all, what part of South Vietnam were you in?
I was in 4 Corps, and our base at Vinh Long was practically right in the middle of the Delta, and we were located on the Mekong River. So we had patrol and security responsibility for the entire Delta, including the Cambodian border, from an area called the Parrots Beak, where Cambodia patrols into South Vietnam, all the way around to the South China Sea, Rock Jaw, and then all the way back up to the mouth of the Mekong. So even though, the story is that, VC were largely wiped out in the Tet Offensive, they were still quite prominent in the Delta, because prior to the Tet Offensive, there had not really been any U.S. Or extended ARVN operations in that area. So they were pretty much free to build up their forces there.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of free fire zones. I would say most of the areas we operated in were free fire zones. And there was an area in the southwest corner, up pretty much up against the sea, called the U Minh Forest. And that was the southernmost exit point for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So there were both VC and NVA in there. And it was quite notorious because some ARVN battalion tried to assault the place back in the early or mid 60s. They went in and basically got wiped out. They were never heard from again. We only flew two or three raids in there. I was on the first one, but they had basic training camps in there. They flew their flag. They had, because it's so slow and swampy there, they had bamboo sidewalks. They had, framed huts in there. And it was just utterly amazing. That they could conduct those type of operations and maintain that type of base, just 45 minutes from where we were stationed.
Yeah, and you say that you're sort of on the the last stop of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I mean, that's about as far south as you can go. So you've got troops coming down from North Vietnam. all the way down into not just 4 Corps, but Southern 4 Corps.
Right.
Um, what did that say to you at the time, um, about the nature of this adversary you were against? I mean, the Viet Cong, these are, local folks who know the area. So I guess mainly I'm thinking about these NVA, the NVA and I Corps, that makes sense.
Right.
NVA and 2 Corps, okay. NVA in Southern 4 Corps. Um, did that, did that sort of grab your attention at the time that?
Oh, yeah, sure. I was very, very surprised to encounter them down there. And I, th- my assumption is they were primarily in that area to train and build, rebuild the VC after the Tet Offensive. I do not believe there were enough NVA in that area to mount, a traditional NVA assault on any of the bases. I kind of thought they were probably cadremen. They did have a POW prison camp in there. So NVA were in there to manage those people. And then they arranged their transportation back up the Ho Chi Minh Trail to stick them in prison in North Vietnam.
I see, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, one of our troops, I was an A troop, B troop actually rescued a special forces guy named Nick Lowe, who had been held for 5 years. And it was actually,
He was being held in 4 Corps.
yeah, for 5 years.
Since we're saying a little bit about the Viet Cong and the NVA, what was your perception of them as an adversary?
Oh, we took them, very seriously. Very seriously. Our engagements with them, other than the mortar attacks that they did on our base at night, our actual engagement with them was often with very small units. And we as scouts would often try to run down VC who were trying to get out of the area. They were basically, they had encountered the Arvins or the American 9th Infantry Division, and they were usually trying to escape when we encountered them.
Now, would that be your helo, if I have it right, often is flying very low? And is it that is your assumption that the sound of your helo sort of, jolted them and caused them to start running? Was that even part of the tactic to get that low, to try to scare them out of the grass?
Yeah, the the primary goal was to try to draw fire to reveal their position. So a 2-man, $29,000 helicopter is a lot easier to lose than $1 million helicopter with 11 guys in it.
Wow.
So one of our main functions was if the higher ups had picked out an area where they wanted to insert troops, either Americans or Arvins, they would pick out a landing zone. These landing zones are always in hostile territory. Well, before the slicks would come down, they would often send the Cobras in to rocket around the landing zone. And then we would go in and hover around the perimeter of the landing zone. And then we would hover in the central area of the landing zone, either trying to draw fire or, in a lot of cases, look for booby traps in the landing, tripwires, sharpened stakes to punch the helicopter belly, saplings tied down. So, and of course, command detonated mines. So we would hover around that, blow the grass down, check everything out. If there was a VC in those situations present, we would usually engage them right away, kill them, and basically just give the commander the assurance that the LZ, was not hot, they could bring the troops in a more relaxed mode and not be worried about those helicopters getting hit with machine gun fire or mortars as they hit the landing zone.
When you're doing these operations, you're looking for tripwires, for example. How far off the ground are you? How far off the ground is the helo?
3 feet, 4 feet. So our rotor wash, if the grass was tall, depending on the season, our rotor wash would cause the grass to move. And when it did that, the tripwires would always disturb it. You could see the
Right.
tripwires.
So the grass maybe wouldn't go down as much because the wire was holding it up, something like
Exactly. So when you're that low and going that slow, it's pretty easy to find. Now, if somebody had received fire in that landing zone, our first orbit of the LZ around the perimeter would, be maybe 10 feet off the ground, and we'd be going a lot faster. We wouldn't be doing 0 knots. We would fly around there at 50 or 60 knots, because if somebody's drawing fire, that means they might shoot at us. So hovering would be a bad idea.
Sure.
So that was the primary way we operated. Then the other way was what I used to, and thought of it like this when I was there, was much like the cavalry on patrol during the Indian Wars.
Mm.
We would, they'd pick an area where they thought there was suspicious activity. 9 times out of 10, it was along the Cambodian border, just inside of the Cambodian border. And we would go out, they would pick an area, and we would just start hovering around, flying up and down the canals, again, looking for footprints, campsites. I mean, believe it or not, it was just like the cavalry of 1876. And, if we found an individual or 2 individual VC, we would generally kill them if they were in a free fire zone. If there were more than that, which I did have an encounter like that one day, we would typically open fire on them, drop a red smoke grenade, and then let the Cobras take care of them.
Cobras would come in.
Yeah.
What sorts of weapons did the Loach have? My understanding is that the pilot was able to control a weapon, and then you had a handheld weapon. Is that right?
Exactly. When I was there, we only had 2-man crews, and the pilot had use of the minigun through a trigger on his control stick. That shot 2,000 rounds a minute and was absolutely deafening. The observers really kind of had their choice of a weapon. I always carried a CAR-15. I don't know if you've seen one, but it's an M16 that's really cut down. It's only got like a 12-inch barrel, folding stock. Because some guys did carry an M16 in the front seat, but for me, it was too awkward. It bumped into the control stick. You had that belt of ammo.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you had a lot of bullets when you had a belted automatic weapon.
Yeah.
But I always carried a CAR-15. And when I was there, we did not have 30-round magazines. We only had 20, which you could only put 18 in or it would jam. And at the rate of fire of the CAR-15, if you held your trigger down, you would empty it in 1.4 seconds. So in some of these quick draw situations, you didn't have time, to walk the bullets up to them. You had to be right on them when you first pulled that trigger, because it was, 1.4 seconds is not a long time.
What year did you arrive, or when did you arrive in South Vietnam?
July 1968.
July 68. And how old were you?
I was 19.
So you're 19. you're a long way from home. You're a long way from mom. You're a long way from any minister. You're a long way from any school administrator, any teacher. Um, you are in a place that is wild and dangerous. You've got a weapon in your hand, and you're in a free fire zone, which, if I understand right, basically means if you see a person, then just assume that person's VC and that person is fair game.
That's right.
That's my understanding. I don't anticipate that you would have sort of thought this through at the time, although maybe you did. But as you look back on that, a 19-year-old kid in possession of extraordinary power in a context where, in a sense, anything goes.
Yes, that's true.
So if you agree with that, sort of that summation, I'm just interested, what does that do to a 19-year-old kid? What's the psychological impact of that kind of being in that kind of world on a 19-year-old kid?
Yes. In my case, being in the scout platoon, you got a lot of praise because in our unit, the scouts were the ones for enlisted men. They were really the only one that had that kind of power. Our infantrymen never went out. The slick crew chiefs, they never really encountered an enemy like we did up close and personal. In my case, because I suddenly had a ton of responsibility, not only for American lives, but obviously Vietnamese lives. It did make it, I matured very, very quickly after just a couple, I didn't feel like I was 19. I felt like I was 30. And, the first time, you're clearing out an LZ and the pilot looks at you, who is only 23. He looks at you and says, well, what do you think? Is it safe to put troops in? And that happened to me on one of my very earliest missions. And, I said, I think so. The footprints are dry. We haven't seen anything. So, yeah, let's put them in. And it worked out that day. But I think the maturity and then this really elevated sense of doing something very special. There were not many Loach crew chiefs doing what we did. And one day when we went into the human forest, not only experiencing the human forest, I think I single-handedly killed about 15 or 16 NVA. Not to count the ones that my pilot killed with the minigun, or the couple times that we called in rocket attacks on people that I had spotted. So altogether, we probably killed something like 25 or 30 people in VA. When we got back to the barracks that night, it was like the Academy Awards. I had officers coming over and bringing us beer. The company troop first sergeant, who never came into the barracks, he was there. The company commander was there. My platoon leader was there. It was like, you just hit the game-winning home run in the 7th game of the World Series.
Wow.
It was unbelievable. And they talked about it for days. That's what we were there for. We were there to find and kill the enemy and, make it safe for our guys to move around on the ground.
I think you just answered the question that I have in mind. So 15 that you can say, I know that I took out NVA, and then you do other things, call in support, which will lead to other NVA. in your mind and in the mind of these others who are celebrating, is the celebration because that's 15 fewer people who are going to be trying to kill us tomorrow? Is it because that's 15 fewer advocates of world communism? Um, or does the communist thing play into it at all? Um, what's the reason that this was celebrated?
Well, because your reputation as an individual and as a warrior depended on that score. If you went out and did something like that, you were regarded as a badass. I mean, there's no, no other way to put it. I don't think that any of us ever thought about world communism. Matter of fact, I don't know that I heard it mentioned very much. Reducing the enemy in a certain area, yeah, that was good, but that was secondary and way down the scale of the reasoning for the praise. I mean, it was the body count. And if you were an individual that racked up a big body count, that stayed with you. And in that platoon, I'm not saying we didn't talk about it every day, but in the 6 months, everybody knew how many kills their platoon mates had. It was almost like an informal pecking order. You didn't have to, stencil it on your sleeve, right? Everybody knew, hey, he went so-and-so and he did this, So it was a mark.
Is this one reason why, I'm just interested in your response to this? You often hear from combat veterans about how terrible combat is, the awfulness of it, the burden of it that you carry through life, but also that sense that it was also the most incredible thing I've ever experienced. And I'm just thinking again, I'm kind of stuck on this 19-year-old in a helicopter with a weapon far from home, exercising, I mean, probably the greatest power that a human being can have.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing just in terms of the exercise of power and whatever that does to a 19-year-old kid, knowing that, man, I possess all of this power. My guess is that whatever experiences you had as your life continued and you went into your career, I imagine you've never experienced as much power and as much influence as you did when you were a 19-year-old kid in that helicopter.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And, coming back and going through the college student route and, having a child, and it took me 6 years to get my degree. And then I had a really excellent business career. I actually achieved a lot, but nothing in that career, 45 years in the IT industry, nothing in that career matched the adrenaline rush or the sense of power that I had flying around that little helicopter.
Mm.
Nothing. And I mean, we won, 4 of us formed a company in 2006, and it won, now it has 100 employees, and we won all kinds of awards and, plaques and, everything you can imagine in the business community. But it was a distant second in terms of how I perceived the achievement. And I used to keep a picture of me standing by my Loach on my desk, because when things got crazy and you were working for a jerk or, some client, I spent most of the time in the consulting industry. I could look at that picture and take a lot of strength from it, because I knew, at that point, I had a ton of responsibility, and the decisions that I made there could lead to people, getting killed on my side and certainly on the VC side. So whether or not you close this, deal, small deal, is anybody going to die over it? No, we'll have another deal tomorrow.
Oh, well,
And
yeah.
that stayed with me my entire life.
Mm,
So the respect that I had for my platoon mates who were in the same situation. Guys in that platoon were thoughtful. These guys were pretty bright. They were bright enough to learn how to fly a helicopter
mm,
and had an enormous amount of respect from the pilots, the officers and warrant officers who we flew with, because they recognized what we were handling as a 19-year-old.
I'm guessing that this memory that you have of that day are still focused on that one day where you're confident that there are 15 fewer enemy in NVA uniforms at the end of that day than there were at the beginning of that day, and that was the result of specifically of your work. I'm guessing that that day and that the memory of that day has kind of had a life of its own. And if so, I'm wondering how your thinking about that day has evolved over time, or if it has, or maybe another way of putting the question, how that memory has sort of lived its own life in conjunction with the life that you've been living since coming home from Vietnam.
Right. Well, when I first came home, and this applies to all the violence that I unleashed. I had a tremendous sense of confusion. How did we get into this mess?
Mm.
And a pretty high degree of guilt after I learned the true history of our involvement, that, regardless of what you think about the communists, that's what the people of that country wanted. I had periods in my life where I never killed any women and children. I never lined anybody up in a ditch and shot them.
Yeah.
It was always a combat setting. But I often wondered whether I was any better than a German SS soldier to be able to unleash that level of violence on people who, in reality, nobody wants to admit it, but they were the patriots. They were fighting for their country. We were the invaders. And I got to tell you, I pondered this. I still ponder it to a degree, but I've gotten rid of the guilt. But, we were wrong to be there. And unfortunately, so many people do not want to admit the truth about it. And I think that makes the problems that the Vietnam veterans suffer much worse because they can't reconcile it, and they cling on to the false beliefs about how we could have won. We just needed to kill more of them, more bombing, more violence, and never really stepping back and saying, okay, who are the real players here? Is I used to think a lot about everybody in my platoon who flew combat missions had the understanding that the South Vietnamese were never going to win. The ARVN was just too weak. We hated them at that point until I learned why they behaved the way they did. I had a great deal of animosity toward them. But it was just obvious. I mean, they would not fight. They wouldn't fight for us. They wouldn't fight for their own buddies. you know, I saw a special forces guy having to beat people with a pistol belt to get them to go up a hill, and they weren't even receiving fire. You know, they're just walking up a hill, but they were too scared to do it.
And you, if I could just jump in here for a second, you described, your perception of the ARVN is that these guys won't fight, but on the other hand, there are occasions where South Vietnamese civilians are in their power, and in those cases, these ARVN are brutalizing South
Totally,
Vietnamese civilians.
totally, absolutely true. And that was one of the things that struck me in my first combat mission. Who are we fighting for? These guys are brutal. You know, I mean,
To their own people.
to their own people. Yeah. And I kind of felt like it was a gigantic organization of cowardly bullies. You know, when they had power over people, they would do unimaginable things to them. But as soon as a shot was fired, they're on the ground, you know, with their nose in the dirt. I mean, it was like, why are we here? And to me, the really astounding part of it is, while we all had those thoughts, we would still go out and get in that helicopter the next day and go out and rain havoc on these guys.
What you just said reminds me of a passage that really stuck out to me. You referred to a contradiction most of us felt about the war. You say that the ARVN's hearts were not in the effort, whereas, going back to the beginning of our discussion, the VC and the NVA, clearly their hearts were in the effort. Without that is, without the ARVN's hearts being in the effort, we could not see how they were going to defeat the VC. Simultaneously, you've got anti-war protests at home. Here we are, 68, 69, so all of that's heating up. We talked about all of this during our nightly games back on base.
Yeah.
Yet each morning, we would climb into our ships and go out to chase and kill those we considered the enemy. I was never able to reconcile this paradox to my satisfaction. Now, I mean, that, as you indicated, that really, bothers you a lot after the war. During the war, was that something, it sounds like it was something that you noticed the year you were there, but was that something that with relative ease, you were able to just kind of turn off and not worry about it at the time? Or as you're flying to wherever you're going, is that kind of going through your mind, like, we're going VC hunting right now, but the ARVNs are afraid of them, so what are we doing here?
Yeah. I don't think it actually was a topic of contemplation while we were actually on a mission. But I think all the guys that I knew had maybe an overdeveloped sense of mission. And, when you strapped yourself in, there was no room for doubts. I mean, you're going into something very, very, very dangerous, and you better have a certain degree of confidence that you're doing the right thing. So we didn't sit around like philosophers and contemplate it. I did have one pilot who, this is where we were reined in one day, and we were sitting in the Loach, and he asked me, what chance did I think the South Vietnamese would have to actually establish a working democracy? And, I said, I thought it was less than 50-50, because it's obvious they can't defend themselves. And he went on further to say, well, how can they build a Western style democracy when everybody in the country does one of two things? They're fishers or farmers. How are you going to have a free market economy when 90% of the people produce the same product? And I hadn't thought about it. Of course, he had a college degree, so he had been introduced to these kinds of themes. But then, after thinking about it for a long time, I'm like, we're trying to force something on these people that is completely foreign to them, and it just did not mesh with their culture. When I saw these people initially, I had such a great deal of pity for them because they did not have the opportunities that Americans had. I saw them as being oppressed, under military threat, and just no opportunity to better their day-to-day lives. Little did I know, they didn't want to better their day-to-day lives. They wanted to live the agrarian, style of life, be farmers, stay close to their villages. They didn't need, a copier machine factory, in the village. They had their own way of life.
There's a photo that I have of yours, and I believe that the photo was taken, it's of South Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese are, if memory serves, they were wanting to collect things from trash that had been created from the base. Is that right?
And that's right. And that lady that's in the center of the photograph, was like a female tiger guarding her cubs. I mean, slapping people, pushing people around. It was a literal free-for-all. And
To
that
get
was
whatever they could get from the garbage.
yeah, that was my one and only trash run. But again, that was when I was in maintenance. I hadn't been there long. That just reinforced the belief that, boy, these people need a lot of help.
And was that part of your thinking then when we're thinking about the mission? Probably not thinking, as you've said, not thinking a whole lot in 1968 on the ground in 4 Corps, South Vietnam, not thinking a whole lot about the problem of global communism, thinking a lot about the fact that there are people out there who want to kill us. And so one mission is to deal with them. Did it also become part of your mission, though, to think, even though you're feeling pretty ambivalent about the situation in South Vietnam, at least, well, maybe what I'm doing is giving these folks, like the lady in the photo, giving them a shot to, to improve their lot somehow. Was that part of your thinking as well?
Yes, it was, maybe the first 6 or 7 months. I definitely believed when we went in, we were doing the right thing to give these people a chance. I was a true believer, and it wasn't until I actually started, flying combat missions, working with the ARVNs, being around the villagers and whatnot, that it started to dawn on me that something isn't right here. And that's basically the level that I arrived at while I was in country. To give you an idea, when I got home, unfortunately, my girlfriend had rheumatic fever, so she couldn't go out. The very first thing I did was to go to the public library and get every Life magazine that was published while I was overseas to see what kind of coverage, is the war getting and what is being said. Because another thing, while we were there, we were all subjected to this. The Armed Forces radio network was just a propaganda arm. And we heard things on there about places being pacified where we'd gone in there and had ships shot down and, people killed. And what do you mean it's pacified? You come down and walk through there, it ain't pacified. That was every day. I mean, so you've got the government lying in the background, and it's incapable of being reconciled with what you're actually seeing and experiencing on the ground.
Sometimes vets say, that the only enemy they ever saw was after a firefight, when they went out, and then there they saw the Viet Cong who's wounded or dead. That's the only time, or maybe they captured somebody. But in firefights, you're in the boonies, thick jungle, you don't really see them, you're just shooting. And then,
Right.
so you don't know whether any bullet you ever fired actually hit anybody. And I suppose that that creates a burden of its own, just sort of that question mark. In your case, there's not a question mark because you describe in your memoir, of specific cases where there is absolute certainty that you pull the trigger. And it's almost like, tell me if I'm wrong, it's almost like you can see something that happened in a second, less than a second, but it's almost like slow motion. Sometimes I hear vets say, you can see the impact, 1, 2, 3, and it becomes this incredibly slow motion thing. There's no ambiguity whatsoever in your case. Is that, I mean, does that figure into what you're referring to as guilt? I guess I'm wondering about sort of what this sense of guilt is made of. Is it that you can see that other person's face? You can you can see that again and again. You have these images in your mind's eye, and is that part of it? The burden of there's the burden of not knowing if a bullet I shot ever hit anybody, but then I imagine there's a very different burden that comes with an absolute lack of ambiguity. I know for certain
Yeah.
me pulling the trigger had a final consequence for someone else. Is that part of it? I guess I'm just asking, what that sense of guilt that you refer to, what it's made of.
Yeah. I think I kind of generalize the guilt. At times I would ponder the fact that, that guy or those guys, they have families. They were far away from home in most cases. And I've taken all that away from them. And I like I said, I was pondering that a lot. And that's what led me into the moral injury therapy. But my guilt was more like the fact that we were there and trying to impose our will on them, and that they were the patriots and we were killing the patriots. So it wasn't so personalized. And one thing about that is, yes, I'm seeing in every case, I'm seeing the person I'm shooting, no doubt about it. I can see the tracers hitting, but I'm in a helicopter with a jet engine. I don't hear any screaming. I don't have to get out and search his body. I don't have to look at his face after I've killed him or while he might be dying, because there's this guy and then there's another guy over here you got to go get. And, grunts on the ground had to deal with that. I didn't, being at 3 feet, you see them, you know what's going on, you better be quick. But we didn't have to, I don't want to say revel.
You can just move on.
Huh?
You can just move on.
You just move on. Yeah, there's no, I want to say no secondary consequence. Your first emotion is relief. Yeah, I got him, he didn't get me. And I did have a couple, up close and personal quick draw contests. And interestingly, I suppressed that memory from 1969 until 1985. I literally completely forgot about that action. And
which action?
This was when we were in the human forest, and we had gone from shooting at a guy, and my car 15 jammed. So the pilot, you didn't want to hover around where you knew there was an enemy. So we moved over, I don't know, 100 yards, 50 yards or something, to a more wooded area. Well, I cleared the jam. Well, as soon as I got the jam cleared, he's yelling, look to 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Well, I looked up from my door, and just across this little canal, maybe 15 feet wide, 2 NVA are stepping out of the woods, dense woods. And I don't know whether they heard us or not, but they didn't start taking their rifles off their shoulder until they had stepped out and we had seen them. So I got my rifle on my Car 15 ready to go and shot them both, killed them both. And then we went back to the first guy that I had only wounded, and we killed him. And then the pilot said, well, let's go check on the 2 guys by the canal. When we flew back there, and it was only 10 seconds, right? I mean, it was no time. These guys were laying in the water up against the bank. The water is a caramel color. And there is a blood stain on the water that's, like 20 feet in diameter, reaching from the opposite bank all the way to the other bank. When we dove down to check on them, they also had these kind of blue-green jackets on that I've never seen before. When we dropped down on that, it almost looked like a Christmas scene with the brilliant red in the water, their blue-green jackets, and then the green of the forest. Well, for some reason, that memory disappeared. And, I don't even remember remembering it or talking about it that evening. But one night, I'm at home in bed with my wife. What pops into my mind? This visualization of these 2 guys floating in this huge pool of blood. Because I was so shocked that there was that much blood. I mean, it was huge. And the fact that I had not thought about it, or it had never been in my consciousness after the event, it was stunning. I don't think I went back to sleep that night. It was just like, wow, where did that come from? And of course, as soon as it made itself aware to me, then I remembered everything about it. You mentioned, the sound of the helicopters tipping them off. An Oh-6A did not have that wop, wop, wop of a Huey, because there were 4 rotor blades and they were spinning so fast. It literally sounded like an electric fan. Well, on a mission, we were flying down a canal. There was a little island in the middle of the canal with trees on it. And we were coming from downwind. So they didn't have an opportunity to hear us. When we flew over those trees, which were about 20 foot high, there were about 20 NVA napping in the shade. And believe it or not, we flew over them, started to do a U-turn, and we're like at treetop level. And I started shooting at them with my Car 15, and that's what woke them up. So there was this mad scramble for them to get the weapons. And then the pilot hit them with a minigun, then we dropped smoke and the Cobras came in. It was a mess. They never heard us. Never heard us.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your memoir, and that's from my mind, but that's right.
It was mind blowing because, just cruising around and damn, there they are, the real enemy.
Listening to you just relate these things, I'm reminded of that, the title of that famous Vietnam novel by Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carry, and in war, the not you, but the grunts, you hear from the grunts who are carrying 100 pounds of stuff, out in the boonies. So you carry that stuff in war, but then there's the stuff you carry after the war. And I'm listening to you share these stories, and I'm thinking, I mean, I have no idea what it would be like to carry these things um, after the war. So I'll pitch the question to you, knowing that you can't, it's impossible to convey it to somebody who's never experienced it. And, you get into these kinds of questions and you realize how little language can really get done, but how would you describe that to the vast majority of us who can hear what you say, who can read what you write, but who can't really understand it for having never experienced it? But to the extent possible, how would you describe what it is like to carry these things through your life?
I would say that those memories are ever present, while the distractions of day-to-day life, raising a family and running a company, that those types of activities do a great job in suppressing and letting it, and not allowing those memories to eat you up or destroy your life. You know what I mean? You can focus on other things. But
Mm.
the reality is all of those memories are just below the surface, waiting their chance to pop up. So some type of trigger might bring it all flooding back, pretty quickly. And a lot of times when that would happen, I'd be in a business setting or something. It's kind of like a daydream. And the clinical name for it now is flashback. I don't imagine that I'm in Vietnam. I never think I'm in my helicopter, but it's just an intrusive memory. And it comes 5 seconds, 10 seconds later, it's gone. But like I said, it's just below the surface, and it'll pop into your, visual sensation, and then it disappears. Well, if it's an unpleasant memory, and I've got several, it'll actually cause me to start. It's like I'm startled just to recall that memory. It almost, I guess it does shock me, that that event occurred.
As you know better than I, there are, just radically different views about the war. There is the view that the war was a noble cause and we betrayed the South Vietnamese by leaving. There's the other view that we never should have gotten there in the first place. And then between those, there are sort of intermediate things. Well, maybe we shouldn't have been there, but since we were there, we should have prosecuted it differently. Also, you hear from vets who say, you hear some who say we could have won, had our hands not been tied with rules of engagement, and had we really just gone all the way with military firepower. There are others who say no, we could have won the war had we actually done that less and focused more on the hearts and minds side.
Right.
And so there are all these things. Are you saying that your view is it would be a relief to veterans if they were able to understand the hard but simple thing that the war was a mistake, rather than the much more intellectually, spiritually, psychologically taxing thing of saying we could have won, but we didn't, and trying to figure out why? Is that the view you're expressing?
Exactly. That is my view.
What's interesting to me is we've said all of this, or you've said all of this, and I've responded a little bit, all of this over the past several minutes. But in your memoir, you say that you're proud of your service. So how do those things go together? I mean,
Yep.
it seems that there's at least a little tension there. How do those things go together?
Yeah, I've wrestled with that
Mm,
since 1969.
yeah.
And I think the way I frame it is that in the context of being willing to put yourself and your life on the line for what your country thought and told you was the right thing to do, you know, I know I did everything I possibly could. I intentionally put myself at risk because I could have stayed in maintenance. And
Mm,
I did as dangerous a job as anybody in the country. And I did that voluntarily. And I'm sure that I helped save lives on our side of the fence. So I think I'm proud of the bravery that I displayed. I'm proud of how I matured and adapted to the environment. And, you know, at least temporarily came away as a success, till my confusion turned into knowledge. But believe me, I have asked myself that question, and that was a big deal during my moral injury therapy. I served bravely. Some people would say even foolishly, to put myself at risk. But it was in the context of an immoral war. So at ground level, I'm proud of what I did. But the umbrella
yeah.
was I was in the wrong war.